Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover two primary topics. The first one is going to be the issue of Armenian POWs that are being held by the regime in Baku. And then we're going to have a special focus about the statements of the last Artsakh president, Armenian, and the issues related to him. Let's start off with the first section, which is about our POWs. We're going to start with the latest news, which is news about the trial, or the so-called trial of Vakif Khachaturian. What is the background with this? This is the gentleman that was arrested while being evacuated out of Artsakh during the blockade. He's a 68-year-old man with a heart condition, and he was being evacuated by the Red Cross, and then he was kidnapped by the Azeri regime. Then they came up with these false charges against him about him being involved in human rights violations and other things, which all ended up being farcical. His trial, if you call it that, was essentially a show trial in which even that they lied about his testimony, in which he was, they were claiming that he's in Armenian, saying that he's guilty of these crimes or apologizing, when in fact he was saying, I'm not guilty of anything, and he wasn't apologizing. They ended up sentencing him after this quick show trial to 15 years in prison. And the reality is, if you're a 68-year-old man with a heart condition, a 15-year sentence is actually a death sentence. The reality is that this gentleman is being convicted not of any crimes he committed, but essentially a crime of being Armenian, which is, in this case, something that can send you to prison in Aliyev's kingdom. This example of this farcical fake trial in Baku actually brings us a bigger question, which is the massive failure of the Armenian state, this particular government, and essentially the Armenian nation in fighting for the rights of people being held illegally in the dungeons of Baku. And if you really want to understand the scale of our failure, I think we have very good recent examples of what's going on in Israel in the war with Hamas. All over the world, and this is grassroots activity, you see people who are pro-Israel putting up pictures of the more than 200 Israelis that were kidnapped by Hamas and taken to Gaza on every street corner in the world. While on the Palestinian side, you have news outlets like Al Jazeera that personalize the stories of Palestinian children that were killed in the bombings and other things. And you see how this is being weaponized, how this is being publicized. What you're seeing here is the personalization of all these narratives on both sides. So essentially both sides are saying our kidnapped victims or people murdered are not nameless, faceless individuals. They come with specific stories and narratives. Frankly, in our case, nobody knows. No one has the pictures or the names of many of the people that we have that are captives in Baku, except for the few famous names like Ruben Vartanian or the former president of Artsakh and a few political leaders. This lack of personalization actually makes it much easier for the regime in Baku to get away with the criminality that it's getting away with. Now let's examine the failures of the state in this case. And frankly, if you understand politics, the lack of action is actually quite understandable because any public campaigns that are run by the state side will actually embarrass them and highlight the ineffectiveness of their policies in this regard, especially in the realm of freeing our POWs since the end of the war in 2020. Secondly, it will show that this entire peace process has actually given Armenia nothing. This peace process that they keep talking about, its only thing that it's accomplished is to legitimize the ethnic cleansing that was carried out by the Aliyev regime in September of this year. And in the case of POWs, the fact is that we have actually more POWs in the dungeons of Baku now than we did in November of 2020. It's obvious that they had a plan B in getting our hostages released, which is to get some kind of a peace deal signed, in which part of it would be releasing all of the people that are being illegally held in Baku of this mythical peace deal. But now everyone, including them, knows that there's not going to be a peace deal and nothing is going to be signed. And the reality is that they actually don't have a plan B. There is an out of all of this, frankly, if we actually have the ability to use a little bit of political imagination that can actually be a winner, not just for the state, but for our society, and actually work on getting all of our prisoners freed. And that is to essentially launch a public campaign that channels the anger and the angst that exists in the Armenian world, both in Armenia and in the diaspora, on focus on getting these people back home. And why do I say that? It's because of all the issues out there, this is actually the only one that unifies the entirety of the Armenian nation and the entirety of the political process. There's no one that will disagree with any public campaign that is designed to get our hostages free and bring it back home. And this could actually be a great bridge-building device between Armenian diaspora and different political factions to come together, to put aside their differences, and try to all win together to get their piece of the credit involved in a fight to get our hostages back home. Now, what would a campaign like this look like? I think it all starts, frankly, with personalization. Everything in the modern world of communication is about telling stories and telling narratives. Secondly, it needs to be a very public, open, aggressive campaign. One of the things that I think we should look at is adoption programs. And what I mean by that is you essentially divide up the hostages that we have, the POWs, among world leaders that adopt one or two, parliamentarians that take the other two, celebrities, retired prominent political figures, business leaders, and diaspora institutions that essentially take responsibility for two or three individuals that they're constantly talking about, that they're constantly working on, that they're constantly telling the stories of, and make it an issue for every regime official from Baku that goes anywhere to deal on a daily basis, one way or the other. They have to answer for the fact that these people are being held illegally. This obviously needs to be married to a significant public relations campaign. The resources are there. We have the money to hire people like that, both on a state level and a private sector level, to actually push this agenda. There obviously needs to be a centralized coordinating office. It could be something in our foreign ministry, or it could be something that's a hybrid of state, non-state, or something that is entirely a private sector initiative. But it is something, an address that is focused on a group of people that come to work every day that are actually focused on this issue and nothing else all day. And then I think what you move on to is what I call a price tag campaign, in which you make this an issue and you make everyone that deals with the regime in Baku, that goes to conferences, pay a price for their association with the regime in Baku. Now, you might say how this is ineffective, but let me give you a perfect example. You know, one of the leading degenerates in the world that was doing business with the regime in Baku was Tony Blair. Tony Blair has no morals and has no standards. However, he has a reputation. And if he's constantly being pounded and attacked for his association with the regime, he's going to drop them because he can make a lot more money in other places. This is also a perfect opportunity to constantly put the regime on trial for its criminal activities, because bottom line is, even the regime apologists have a hard time justifying keeping people as prisoners of war years after the war, after the ceasefire demands that they need to be freed. Now we're going to move on to the second topic of the week, which is issues surrounding the last Artsakh president, Samvel Shahramanyan, and some developments along those lines, and some basic questions that I think we need to ask of that gentleman. This week, he was actually formally asked to testify in front of a committee, a parliamentary committee that's investigating the 2020 war. One interesting side note with this is they've been investigating that war for almost 3 years, and in most countries, this kind of investigations come out within 6 months, and you have reforms within a year. I think by the time they get done, there'll be dogs that'll be born and die before they actually finish this investigation. What we move on to is some of this that's prompted this is there was significant demonstrations in front of the Artsakh embassy in Armenia, which is the current headquarters of the Artsakh government. These demonstrators were trying to find out under what circumstances Mr. Shahramanyan actually signed the order to dissolve the Republic of Artsakh. Mr. Shahramanyan eventually engaged with the demonstrators and actually made a few statements, which I'm going to read to you, which are actually, I think they're quite intriguing. What he said is, most of the questions pertain to social issues, accommodations, employment, and salary. Not everything depends on us, but we'll try to give solutions to your issues, Shahramanyan told the crowd. And then he went on to say, next question pertained to our political future. I'd like to apologize to everyone, but there are questions that I don't consider appropriate to disclose because it could contain dangers for us. he said, elaborating and finishing his quote. It's very hard to hear his statements without actually coming up with a list of questions, not just from people from Artsakh, but the totality of the Armenian nation. Let's start off with the first question, Mr. Shahramanyan. You speak of dangers for us on issues that you don't want to discuss. But I'm sorry, what can be a greater danger than what we just went through, which was ethnic cleansing and genocide of Artsakh? I don't think there's anything that is more dangerous than that. Let's move on to the second issue, which is the primary issue that many people have with you. By what authority or right did you sign away Artsakh's statehood? Something that is clearly beyond your constitutional mandate. The Artsakh Republic was set up by the vote of the people, and I cannot be done away with you signing some Nazi-type agreement with the regime in Baku and the Russians. Third is, what is your relationship with the Russian state, and were you following their orders in dismantling Artsakh's statehood? The fourth issue is, what was the specifics that you negotiated with the regime in Baku in secret, and what did it have on the guarantees of every Armenian, especially prominent ones, people like Ruben Vartanian and former Artsakh leadership, to be able to leave Artsakh, and the return of all POWs and civilians that have been captured or are being held in the dungeons of Baku? Did you negotiate their release? And if you didn't, why not? Fifth question, was your election at the time, when it happened a few weeks before the attack on September 19th, part of a scheme to trigger an invasion of Armenia to legitimize the regime's attack on Armenia and eventually actually legitimize the attack on September 19th? And last and most importantly, how is it that you were allowed to leave Artsakh without being kidnapped? Well, every other political leader that came before you is sitting in the prisons and the dungeons of Baku. In conclusion, it is said that victory has 1,000 fathers and that defeats an orphan. Our job here is not to personalize things and cast things that are far more of a national nature into one or two individuals, but it doesn't mean that there aren't responsible parties. It is very important for us to ask the hardest questions. Everyone who's responsible for this catastrophe, to ask ourselves those questions relentlessly, because frankly, the way forward is by embracing the truth in this harshest term. As far as Mr. Shahramanyan goes, it will be the Armenian nation. They will eventually judge him for what he was. Was he simply a useful idiot for the regime in Baku or Moscow, or some Armenian version of Masha Petan? Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.